Hi, I'm Sam with jbugs.com. We're reassembling the chassis for our 1971 Eurolux Super Beetle, and before we put the body back in place, we want to get as many parts installed into our chassis as possible. Our next step will be installing a rebuilt Pro Street Flyer transmission and the transmission shift rod. We start at the bench and begin by installing urethane transmission mounts into the bell housing. The urethane mounts have metal inserts that install at the mounting holes. The spacers prevent the mount from being crushed when bolting them in place. For the rear mounts, there are 4 short bolts which will point down and bolt the mount to the crossmember, and 4 longer bolts that hold the mounts to the transmission. Washers are set in place onto the bolts before sliding the bolts into the mount. The mount is set in place into the transmission. More washers are set in place over the bolts in the bell housing, and nylock nuts are threaded in place and tightened down. Next, we'll install the rear crossmember, and we opt for a rear transmission support kit, which has a strap that installs over the bell housing for additional support. We painted our mount to blend in with the chassis, and after the paint was dry, we set it in place under the transmission and the mounts. We set lock washers on the bolts, and then thread the nuts in place. Using a flathead screwdriver while holding the bolt down helps to thread the nuts on, as does using a pair of vice grips to hold the crossmember in place to the bell housing. Once all 4 nuts are threaded on, they're all tightened, and then at the driver's side of the transmission, the 2 nuts on the side cover at the 10 and 11 o'clock position are removed so we can install the original clutch cable tube bracket. We don't tighten the nuts as the bracket will come back off for a moment when we install the clutch cable. The transmission is set upright so we can install the urethane nose cone mount, and with the metal inserts set into the mount, washers are installed at the center recesses, bolts are inserted through the nose cone into the mount, and the nylock nuts are threaded down and tightened. The last piece we'll install before setting the transmission into the chassis is the nose cone boot, which installs over the shift shaft. We set the trans into the chassis, nose cone first, lining up the holes in the front mount with the studs on the chassis, making sure that the metal inserts don't pop out. The original frame horn bolts and washers are threaded through the rear crossmember into the chassis loosely. Then we jack up and support the front of the transmission. The metal inserts for the nose cone mount are tapped into the mount so we can install washers and the nuts, which are tightened down. The rear frame horn bolts are tightened down. Then the clutch tube bracket that we set in place earlier is removed and slid over the clutch cable and tube. We set the bracket on the transmission again and verify that the clutch cable Bowden tube is curved from the chassis to the transmission. The Bowden tube, as it's named, should have a roughly 1-inch bow for the clutch cable to operate properly. A clutch cable tube seal is slid over the cable and onto the tube, and the cable is set in place at the clutch arm on the transmission. We don't have a wing nut handy at this moment, but if you do, thread it on now. We do have the fuel line grommets though, so we spray some silicone spray onto the tube and the grommet, and then slide it in place into the chassis. Next, we install a shift rod clip onto a shift rod bushing. Then we slid the bushing into the shift rod hanger into the tunnel through the shifter hole. We grease the inside of the bushing and coat the length of the shift rod, as it has to slide all the way through the bushing. The rod is routed through the front of the chassis and into the shift rod bushing. This is a little easier in our chassis since we cut a clutch cable access hole. Otherwise, a long piece of pipe can be used to push the rod through the bushing to the back of the chassis. There, we can reach in through the shift coupler access hole and pull the rod back. The shift rod is rotated so that the shifter cup is upright in the shift mount hole, Then we install a new heavy-duty shift coupler cage onto the transmission shift shaft. The grub screw for the cage is threaded in and tightened down, and the shift rod is lifted into place into the coupler. A urethane bushing is set into the side of the cage. Then the cross nut with the washer in place is slid through the bushing and the shift rod. The opposite urethane bushing is set into the coupler, and the set bolt with the washer are threaded in and tightened down. Safety wire is routed through the grub screw, twisted and wrapped around the shift shaft, and looped around the screw. The shift coupler access plate is installed. We install the fuel line grommet at the front of the chassis. And then back at the transmission, we install the top strap for the rear transmission support kit. We thread on a clutch cable wing nut, and we finish this video by screwing our custom clutch cable access hole cover in place. Coming up in our next video, we'll continue the work on the chassis, and install the emergency brake and heater controls. Thanks for watching. Let us know if you have any questions in the comments below. Make sure to click the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, when you need parts for your vintage Volkswagen, head over to jbugs.com.